In this video, we're going to talk about the transportation revolution. Transportation revolution gets started with wagon roads. So in the early days of the United States, the only way to really get around was by horse and also by wagon. And they would connect these wagons to horses, and they would use these wagons, use these horses to travel across the United States. But before these wagon roads were developed, it was very difficult to travel using these wagons. And so in the early 1800s, we start to see wagon roads develop, and the United States government realizes that it would be a smart idea to develop a big road that would help wagons and people travel from the East Coast over here. This is the East Coast over here to the West. And so Congress decides to authorize the building of a national road to connect the Atlantic Ocean with the Mississippi River. So Atlantic Ocean is over here, and the Mississippi River is that large river that flows in the middle of the United States. And so the idea is that we are going to create a wagon road that is going to connect these communities on the East Coast by the Atlantic Ocean to these newer communities that are just developing out west all the way to the Mississippi River. So in 1817, construction begins on this wagon road, this national road that is going to travel from basically on the border here between Virginia, Pennsylvania, and it's kind of hard to see here, but Maryland is also right there in the mix. So sort of between the three states here, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, that's where this national road is going to start. And it's going to travel west, and it's going to connect those three states with Ohio right here. It's going to continue on into Indiana, which is right here. It's going to go on into Illinois, right here. And the western border of Illinois is the Mississippi River. Okay? So this national road, this road that the government is going to authorize to be built, is going to connect several states, and it's also going to connect east and west. And so the building of this road took place from 1817 to 1838. And that is when the National Road is finally complete. The National Road was a transportation project that was built to promote settlement out west, and it proved to be very successful. The new National Road influenced the movement of people, products, and ideas across the West, expanding the nation by making it faster and easier to move out west. It also helped with the development of new businesses along the National Road, and it was easier, faster, and cheaper to move products. And so it also allowed for newspapers and mail to get to settlers out in the West, and it just really overall made it a lot easier for people who were living out here in the East to be able to move out here to the West. So the first phase of the transportation revolution had to do with horses and wagons and making roads that you could travel on your horse with your wagon much easier. The second phase of the transportation revolution has to do with canals. Now, canals were basically man-made rivers. As you can see over here to the left, this is a really good example right here of a canal. And what they would do is they would just sort of dig out a hole where water could collect, and that would create a man-made river, which is what we call a canal. And as you can see right here, this is like a modern day canal. They're still used around the world. We don't use them as much as we did in the 1800s when it was a newer technology, but it is still used. One thing that's different, canals and rivers, between the two. There is a lot of differences between the two, but the number one main difference is, of course, a river is something that naturally occurs, whereas a canal is man-made, and rivers have currents. So rivers flow a certain way. They usually go from high ground to low ground, and there's a current. And so in a river, you just naturally can, stick something on that river, and it's going to naturally flow one way. A canal, since it's man-made, doesn't exactly have a current. So what they would do is, and if you look at this picture down here at the bottom, notice these horses or these mules. They would sometimes use horses, mules, oxen, a really strong animal to help them pull their boat. I don't know if you can see this, but there is actually a little rope that is connected to these horses, okay? And as the horses walk this way, okay, they're going to pull that boat up the canal. And as you can see, there are a couple of horses over here connected to the boat. And so since there's no current to naturally push the boat, you're going to have animals that are going to help you sort of pull your boat down this canal. And so, rivers were the most popular form of transportation. At the time, you could travel down a river much faster than a wagon road. So as wagon roads are becoming more popular, people are thinking, it'd be great if we had more rivers, since rivers are the primary form of transportation that most people are using at the time. So they start to create these man-made rivers, which are known as canals. And that's sort of what comes in the second phase of the transportation revolution. After the development of canals, people started to look at ways of improving boats, because a boat couldn't naturally travel any way on a canal without having an animal tied up to it to push it. People started thinking of ways that they could get boats to move themselves without an animal connected on land. And people started to think about putting an engine on a boat so that it would move a certain direction. And that's when we come up with the invention of steamboats. Steamboats are developed in the 1800s because boats could only travel downstream and not upstream. And so rivers usually traveled from a high place down to a low place, and that's really the only direction you could go. You had to go with the current. You could not go against the current. But that was until steamboats were developed. So once steamboats are developed, you don't have to necessarily go just one way down a river. Now you can go against the current. You can go upstream instead of only downstream. And so steamboats allowed boats to travel upstream, downstream, in canals, either way. The first commercial steamboats provided a fast and inexpensive way for people and for goods to travel. With a steamboat, any place connected with a waterway was now within reach. Better roads for wagons, canals, and steamboats all revolutionized the way people traveled in America. But the most important invention that changed the way people traveled in America in the 1800s was the development of the railroad. The railroad changed the entire culture of the country. And so let's take a look here at the picture. This right here is a railroad track. These railroad tracks would create basically a road for train cars to travel on. And here's a picture of a train car. And so these train cars, they could carry people, they could carry things, and they would go on these railroad tracks, and they would go over land. And so up until this point, the only way to really travel over land was on these wagon roads, which definitely improved travel. But people started to think of even better ways to travel across land. And so these railroad tracks start to develop. These railroad cars run on the railroad tracks, and wherever there were railroad tracks now, people and goods could be transported. So the rivers became sort of like the first highways in America, at least until the railroad is developed. And so after the invention of the railroad, the United States seemed much smaller. People could travel long distances in much less time. Goods, packages, and letters could also be transported much more quickly. The first railroads began to develop in the 1820s. That's the time when the technology first gets invented. And by the 1830s, it has become very popular, and the railroad industry is born. Most of the early railroad tracks were laid in the northern states to connect large cities that had new factories. So we started to see most of the railroad tracks develop up north, and they connected these different factories which were producing these different goods that needed to be sold. We didn't see a lot of railroad tracks being developed in the South at this time. But by the end of the 1800s, the railroad was the number one primary source of transportation throughout the United States. Railroads started to be developed all through the country, mostly in the North, but also some in the South. And the transportation revolution sort of starts off with wagon roads, and then it goes into canals, which improve water travel. The steamboat improves it even more, but railroads in the end were the most important invention as far as transportation goes in the 1800s.